CSU-WATER. And we're going to cover this work that was contracted by the Strategic Growth Council. And our effective title here is Actionable Research and Community Academic Collaboration. So this was a really interesting discovery process, kind of a meta-analysis about how researchers, especially in the CSU and UC systems, conduct their community-engaged research. And from there, now we'll go in the agenda and some of the things we'll be covering in the next slide, Jace, thanks. So a few minutes on welcome and introductions, purposes and outcomes of the study, what we're finding, objective by objective, and that'll be rolled into the project presentation. And then we have time in the agenda for questions and discussion. So keep those in mind as we go through the material from the project, and then some follow-up and next steps. That's where we'd really love to hear from people in the state agencies and similar operations. So first of all, our team. So I'm in the upper left there, and we have Chris Hale from the Sonoma State University Center for Environmental Inquiry, and Claudia Luke from the same institution, but recently retired with a glorious career. Then we have Jessica Bremner. She's kind of our hired gun, our expert in social environmental science interactions. So she comes from Cal State LA, aka CSU LA. And then we're pleased to have Aliyah Habib. She's an undergraduate student at UCSB and has been just functioning fantastically like a full-fledged co-PI in the project. And our wonderful project manager who keeps us on task is Jace Treveo. So with that, I'll pass it over to Faye Mock for SGC coverage.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Faye Mock, pronouns they and them, Deputy Director of Equity and Government Transformation at the California Strategic Growth Council. This body of work being presented today comes from the capacity building grants from SGC's Climate Change Research Program. The CCR program supported researchers and community partners for participatory-based research that informed climate action benefiting California for all. And this model really allowed for community voices to be actively involved in projects and research and opening access in a way that hadn't occurred before. And this capacity building grant was the third and final round of funding offered through the CCR program. While this program sunset earlier this year, it's really important to celebrate these accomplishments and milestones that were achieved through this program. So I'm really glad to be here and help to kick off this presentation. And now I'll pass it back over to our research team to talk about their work. Thank you.
Thank you for that coverage. So broadly speaking, even though that program funding has been sunsetted, we're thinking and hope you'll be convinced as we go through the presentation and lead towards our discussion of future directions that there could be very broad applicability of what we're covering here and how the project started with SGC. And that is, how can the funding to academic researchers that involve community stakeholders be more impactful and long-lasting? So for example, we're going to be referring to that as actionable outcomes throughout the project. And that could include things like something called Ripple Effects Mapper, which is really tracking in some detail the interactions and the impacts of the projects and that academic community interaction. But oftentimes ripple effect mapping takes a long time, often beyond the funding scope of a lot of projects. So we need to be able to roll in factors like that to do better accounting of actionable outcomes in that funded research. Next, please. So why are we here today? So this is the overview before we get into the project objectives and what we found. So we heard from so many academics, and they had a lot to say, actually, in our survey we did, and the opportunity to give them chances to express their successes and some of the frustrations or maybe obstacles, in addition to the itemized survey questions we had. So that was great fodder and information, along with the many interviews and discussions we had to look at the challenges and successes of this type of research. And then we looked a little bit more detail, how you develop these collaborations and build relationships, which are so important for impacting communities and trying to solve some of their climate and climate-related issues, as well as some of the integrated stakeholder input and feedback. And here by stakeholders, we mean the academic researchers. Hopefully later in our time today, we could think about how to best do a similar study, but one that's focused on community groups and community leaders to get their input on working with academics. And we've been thinking about that quite a bit. And that being a need in all the events we go to and community leaders we talk to in CSU-WATER. So I think that covers the third point. I kind of just covered that verbally. How can we build on this research and the model we have and what our great team has learned already and what we've been doing in this current project? And with that, I'll turn it over to our team member, Chris.
Thank you, Steve. I guess I'm one of those academics that has a lot to say. Um, yeah, this has been a really interesting project, and we split it into basically 4 objectives, 1 through 3A. And so one of the goals was to summarize best practices, and that's kind of what people are doing, not only in the state, but across the country and even across the world. And to illustrate some of those practices, we focused on a few case studies because there are different approaches to community engaged research. We've documented some tool sets, some of which are in use by practitioners and some which could be used more effectively. And then to sort of tie this all together, we added this no cost, volunteer effort to do a survey of researchers across California to get their feedback about what they think would be most effective. And that sort of summarized the entire study. Next slide, please. So objective 1, best practices. Jessica led the literature review, being our hired gun, as Steve says. And that allowed us to help focus on interviews with actual practitioners and research. And then we're going to highlight as one of the partners that CSU-WATER works with, EPIC-N, because we think that having closer collaboration between the state of California and this national organization can actually help turbocharge this kind of research. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of different acronyms for this type of effort. And in the report that you guys will be provided, we used CBPAR for community-based participatory action research. And it's the same no matter what acronym you use, but it's really about breaking down barriers between academia and the community in order to make actionable change in communities. And that's the focus, right? Is actionable change and not just on doing research. So it also requires a cultural shift in both parties in order to try to align calendars and visions and to engage students in this type of effort. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, SGC's already done a lot of work in this area. This is their participatory research to policy model. And of course, it's a cycle, right? Because these efforts continue as you learn, you keep trying to make change, keep trying to refine your model. One thing I want to point out is in this capacity building, there's this blue box on the right that says test hypothesis and collect data. And so this particular model is still built on this notion of universities as doing research. And one subtlety we can talk about later is there are other models out there that perhaps focus on community action. And that's interesting because if you focus on action and you need research, then the research will follow. And focusing on action allows you to involve students of all disciplines, no matter what the problem in the community is. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that different models are probably appropriate for different situations. Next slide, please. And so broadly speaking, I don't know how she did it, but Jessica summarized the entire literature review in one slide. There are obviously benefits to community engaged research because, just like, this is an industry model, right? Where you actually get the clients, the people you're serving, involved in designing the research study and involved in making sure it stays on track. And so that's what academia is starting to do. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. The challenges, of course, are that you can get co-option and unintended harm. So you might have, for example, minority communities that don't have a say, or underserved communities that aren't quite involved, or even in California, which has been a real challenge for some of us, you might work in a conservative area where they don't want to hear any so-called quote unquote liberal ideas. Or you might work in a liberal area, as I do, and they don't want to hear any quote unquote conservative ideas. And so you have to be very mindful of power dynamics and not just pushing through solutions that certain groups want. And I have some stories about that later in the discussion if anyone's interested. Next slide, please. And so the interviews and the literature review provided some key takeaways that we'll end up talking about a lot more later. And the first one really is success through relationships. So the typical granting cycle is, requests for proposals go out and everybody runs around trying to scurry and recruit people to help write the grants and get some funding. And that's not really the most effective model for community engaged research. The successful projects really have people that are dedicated to working in the community, that have pre-existing relationships and that follow up on those relationships later in order to build on their successes. And so that requires a bit of a rethink in how to really deal with this. And then the other issue with this relates to, of course, how you fund it. And it also relates to student engagement. And so is your goal to get teams of students involved in regional challenges and train them to be leaders? Or is your goal to train specialty graduate students in helping with specific problems? And those two goals can have very different approaches. And I'll return to this later in the presentation. And with that, I think I'm passing off to Aaliyah now.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, an important part of this project, going off of what Chris was describing in our key interviews and what we've heard from many components of our project, was our partnership with EPIC-N, which our MOU with this organization has made them an extremely valuable resource for us. EPIC-N stands for Educational Partnerships for Innovation and Communities Network. And essentially what they are, who they are, is they're a nonprofit organization that connects universities with local governments and communities worldwide to collaboratively address social and environmental and economic challenges. And by leveraging that academic resource, they aim to enhance community well-being and promote sustainable development through their projects. And yeah, the EPIC model serves as an excellent point to understand the complicated world of university and community collaborations. And their resources, including their workshops and monthly office hours, are really helpful in aiding that process. Next slide. So yeah, there's three main tools that it's championed for use by researchers, which include the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Ripple Effects Mapper, and the Government Performance Action and Learning, which are all pre- and post-award tools. The Sustainable Development Goals Tracker allows researchers to align their projects with larger scale goals that they see their work improving upon. And it could also help with the funding process by meeting donor and funding expectations. And the Ripple Effects Mapper, both the Ripple Effects Mapper and the GPAL, Government Performance Action and Learning, aim to take snapshots of communities to provide baseline evaluations and also at the end to summarize collaborative effectiveness and what they ended up accomplishing. And the EPIC network also provides virtual training for those seeking to collaborate and evaluate proposals. Yeah, overall, we think that the state should take advantage of the work that EPIC network has done, as they have a lot to offer in engaging institutions with communities. And next slide, please. Oh, I'm going to pass it over to Chris.
Okay, and yeah, just to sort of reemphasize that, they do provide training for researchers and workshops. And so I think leveraging some of what SGC has already done with EPIC could be very powerful. Just to fill this out a little bit more, we picked 6 case studies to highlight in the report. And these are from locations mostly all over the state, but we added Arizona State University and University of Wisconsin-Madison as examples of EPIC-N projects that have used their tools. You can read more about that in the report. But next slide, please. Broadly speaking, there are a few different models that people have used. And so these are just some selected approaches. And one is an undergraduate steering committee model. And that's, full disclosure, that's what we've done at the Center for Environmental Inquiry. And we formed steering committees of local stakeholders and experts. And the stakeholders include government agencies, NGOs, businesses who have an interest in complex problems like homelessness and water quality and fire. And we lead charrettes and community discussions to try to find what issues we need to solve. And these experts actually guide and direct the research real time as it's going on in these classes. So they can encourage faculty to make course corrections. And the advantage is it allows us to involve students of all disciplines and regional issues. So we've got math students, philosophy students, business students, political students, in addition to the standard STEM fields. And so that's training undergraduates to be part of a community. And that's really the strength of a CSU campus, is a lot of the students come locally and they want to stay in the community and they want to make a difference and they want to be kind of the leaders of tomorrow. Another model for community engaged research is sort of graduate training and targeting issues for specific stakeholders. And that's more the model that the Latino Policy and Politics Institute down at UCLA follows. And so they're interested in helping the Latino caucus actually make legislative change. So they will get a call from a politician or a stakeholder saying, hey, something is happening over here. We need to make recommendations in 5 months on this bill. Can you do the research or summarize the research and provide us a brief so we know how to move forward? And that's more individual faculty and individual grad students. And both of those approaches are valid and useful. It just depends how you think about making change in a community. And then the third approach was specifically dealing with tribal engagement. And so, for example, Big Chico Creek Ecological Preserve has really been pioneering this for quite a while. And they realized that if they were going to engage tribal members, that the tribes didn't have the bandwidth to respond to requests for proposals or to help write them or even help get them off the ground. So they dipped into their endowment and actually on their own dime hired an engagement officer specifically to track proposals and work with tribes and to break down those barriers. And it's to the point now where they can simply call a tribal member up and say, look, here's a proposal. We think it would be great. And the tribal person will say, okay, that sounds good. Go ahead, without taking months and getting the whole tribe involved and trying to decide whether to move forward or not, because they trust them because they've invested. And these tribes actually are now involved in major decisions at the university, like hiring presidents and deciding on curriculum. So those three different approaches have been found to be very powerful. Next slide, please. And so the key lessons from our case studies were really to focus on the community relationships. And I think everybody we talked to said there need to be dedicated staff or dedicated staff time required to maintain the relationships because faculty don't have the time. And that's not their focus anyway. Their focus is often on teaching classes and research. And they don't actually have the training, the strategic planning training in order to run a charrette, in order to hear from multiple viewpoints in the community. And all of our practitioners said that an action focus, as opposed to simply a research focus, can help ensure that communities are positively engaged. And so what all that starts to feel like to us is that funding agencies have a part to play in changing academic and community culture and merging the fiscal years of the community with the fiscal years of the university, and in trying to bridge that gap between, you know, having a report that's simply research based and then having a report that the community can act on. It's very different. And so you need people that have had a foot in both worlds. And then one of the interesting things that arose is that in a request for proposals, it can be very helpful to focus on measurable change without having to set that change inside a predisposed framework. So for example, the climate grants that happened a few years ago, everybody had to tick off which sustainable development goals they were meeting. And that's okay, but people don't think that that's that useful, in the sense that the goals are so vague that, anything can meet the goals. But some communities in California are conservative and they don't want anything to do with the sustainable development goals, but they still want to conserve water. And so there are some issues there in proposal framing that could be very helpful for this process. And then finally, grant evaluation training is a serious issue. And we can return to that a little bit later in the discussion, but some of the researchers that are asked to review these new community engaged grants still review them as if they're standard research grants. And that has had some unwanted consequences, I guess I would say. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it back over to Aaliyah for a tool set summary.
Thank you, Chris. So, yeah, aside from EPIC network resources, in this objective, we did a thorough research on pre-existing tools. So these tools listed here speak on resources that are out there for community-based participatory action research already, created by individual researchers, institutions, and the Sustainable Growth Council. These tools can be used to help provide a pretty effective foundation for any researcher or group interested in becoming more involved in community-based participatory action research. And there's a lot of them, but we expand on these more in our report if you're interested in learning more. Next slide, please. So from our toolset research, we found a few key findings. The first one was partner with EPIC N. EPIC N, from what we found, provides tools and training and monthly office hours to assist researchers and staff with CBPAR engagement, and these tools can be used for pre-award, award, and post-award phases of projects. And the next one is facilitate the use of tools and methods currently in use by California universities. There's a number of approaches used by California researchers, which, like we've seen in the last slide, and there's a lot of researchers with limited information or training available. So utilizing those research resources that we found, SGC could act as a clearinghouse or facilitator for these methods. And the next one is encourage the use of self-assessment rubrics by California universities. One of the ones mentioned was the self-assessment rubric for the institutionalization of service learning by Andrew Furco, and that one's really in-depth and can be super helpful. The use of tools and methods that focus in relationship building. A common theme we continue to see is that relationship building needs to be a huge priority, and there are resources available to support it. Be open to non-traditional grant approaches and training. Like Chris was mentioning, there's many ways to do community-based participatory action research, and that calls for many different ways to approach funding and training researchers. And the last one was virtual communication and education portals can enhance community participation. Listed out were a few in the last slide, but there's a lot of different models that can enhance stakeholder accessibility, support cross-institutional learning, and provide lasting educational value, which can be super helpful. And I'll pass it back to Steve. You're muted, Steve.
Sorry, thanks. So picking up on an objective or survey overview, which is a little bit of a creative add-on when we were framing out the project. So our goals for the survey were to complement those interviews and best practices that Chris and Aaliyah covered. And through the feedback we got, we really got a good understanding of some of the researchers' practices, challenges, and incentives before they pursued external funding, for example, while they were executing that project, and then some of the follow-ups to that. And then in the report, we compare some of those results with literature, best practices, interviews, and case studies. So we're really grateful for the input we got on the surveys. And it's been really interesting discovering that. Next slide. So overall, we got 55 respondents. So those are the respondents who completely did the survey on this. We had maybe 80 some that maybe started it or didn't finish a certain part of it, but you could see from this nice figure that Jessica put together that we really focus on California, but through contacts with the EPIC network and colleague Brandon Louie at UC Davis, for example, we had some input from other universities in the eastern part of the country. And also we had people self-identify to some extent, for example, their status. Are they tenure track faculty or faculty without that track level? Or there's research center staff like Chris and Claudia with Center for Environmental Inquiry, for example, and then a few other categorizations. Next slide. So there was so much information that came through the surveys. We just came up with some main takeaways here to share with you today. And like Chris was saying about the university administrative support for building relationships in the communities and doing the community engaged research is that they need more financial administrative support for maintaining those relationships. And throughout the CSU system, each of the 22 campuses have a community engagement offices. We work with many of them on a variety of projects and outreach efforts. And we're kind of talking to them too as well and what their experiences are in fostering this kind of research. And we're learning more and more all the time. And some of those really align with this project here. And it's really great to see that some of these community engaged projects are also student engaged research projects. And so like Chris so well covered that, at least in the CSU system, the students at the CSU campuses are of those communities, and the hopes are that they'll be future community leaders here. So it's really important to get them in this process, both in the academic side and engaging in the communities where they came from. And then a majority of the projects are not one-off projects. And part of that is because we found that through our surveys, many of the researchers already had those community interactions and relationships, and then the funding opportunity came along. So as Chris was describing a bit, it's really hard if you don't have those relationships in place from the time a request for proposals comes out and the funding programs start. It's kind of too late by that point, many people recognize. And relationship building continues to be an important theme in the objectives we're covering here. And there's no one size fits all approach. Like the toolkits are different and such, and we assemble those in our reports. And I think researchers can see what tools fit the needs and goals of their research. Next slide. And then recommendations. So overall, we look at funding frameworks, new or existing funding programs, not just the SGC, but we think that this could apply for many of the state agencies, for example. Relationship buildings and the stories we've gleaned from our interviews and survey, for example. And then institutional change, we could work within the CSU and UC systems, for example, along with input from our EPIC network for some institutional change to best support this research. And I think furthermore, some research, that has more of a community focus and listening to the communities and what they like and what they think needs to be improved in this type of research. So Chris, were you or Jessica covering this topic then?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Yeah, so this is just the next 4 slides. I'm going to go through them fairly quickly and probably return to them in the discussion. But the next 4 slides are just a synthesis of the various issues we've covered in the presentation and the report. And I'll just hit a couple of them that we didn't necessarily cover yet in the presentation. Alternative funding approaches are kind of interesting. There's been some pushback about the depth, I guess, of proposals, trying to write proposals, and then there's always limited money and people spend a lot of time on them. And so some researchers have come up with the lottery style funding approach that NSF, I guess, pioneered a few years ago, where you never know, how a community engaged project is gonna work out because there's so many variables. And so some researchers have pointed out that if you have a proposal that meets kind of the minimum proposal requirements, actually rating that is very difficult. You know, which one's more important than another one. So maybe they should all go into a lottery style grant after minimal screening, and that would ease the administrative burden on people, for example. And then the other piece of that came out is, and this is a common complaint, of course, in proposals, is support novel methodologies. You know, people that are thinking outside of the box can often tend to get downgraded. And so if there's a way to think about how to make sure that doesn't happen, that would be beneficial. And then as Steve was mentioning, the short-term grants can be an issue. You know, if it's a one-off project, you not only have difficulty building relationships to respond to the proposal, but after the funding ends, the project ends. And so that sort of, you know, kills any momentum you might have with the community. And so really thinking about funding relationships is important, because not only do you get relationships and projects going, but if you entrain community members in your process, that in turn opens up more funding from the community. And we've had some success with that up here. Okay, we just changed. Yeah, so, and of course, prioritize relationship building. So long-term relationships are important. And use the relationships to drive institutional change, which is it's a training. Getting that message across to faculty is a training thing that we think SGC could really help with. Next slide, please. Cultural and systemic barriers, change, training, develop, limited. We've talked about that. Next slide, please. Yes, and so broadening student involvement across disciplines, I think, is something we actually believe in, because we need, a lot of times it's not just research we need, it's trying to figure out how to navigate legal frameworks and implement solutions, for example, for homeless individuals across Sonoma County has been really interesting. And trying to break through political barriers, or even something as simple as, you know, two departments in a county might not like each other, and how to implement a solution that everybody else in the county would like has been an interesting learning experience for students. And then, of course, collaboration strengthens outcomes. If you've got input from everybody across the political spectrum and across disciplines, you can actually have a more robust outcome. And then creating space for diverse perspectives we already touched on, but it really needs to be emphasized. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll kind of wrap it up and open it up for questions and discussion. And just personally, a couple of things we'd like feedback on is, what is considered success in the community engaged research realm? And it's not, I don't know if there's an answer to it, but this came up from some of our experience where, you know, we can gather data, you know, all the county agencies can like the solution, they might want to implement it. But there might be roadblocks to getting the solution implemented. And that can be something as simple as personality conflicts in the county. And so at what point do you say, look, we've done our best, and wash your hands of it, or do you keep students pushing on it? And how do we effectively engage communication students? And this came up because some of these issues are so complicated or so fraught. And, you know, folks on the left and folks on the right have opinions, and they're both right and they're both wrong. And so one thing our communication students did in order to defuse city council meetings and board of supervisors meetings is they started making handouts and videos of people that practice in these various areas and playing them for the meeting. And the idea was to humanize people and get people to listen to each other. And so I think there's a big opportunity to engage communication students more effectively in all of these issues. And then one question we had for all of you, of course, is there similar work within the state by state staff, that we could sort of make those connections between the researchers and the various state agencies stronger. And I guess with that, we should probably open up to a full discussion, a Q&A session. What do you think, Steve?
Yeah, and I think we had a note here to reach out to Natalie for commentary on the ongoing research questions, like what is considered success, for example, or some of the
Right.
things you're thinking of in LCI, Strategic Growth Council, and others.
This is great. I'm gonna stop the recording since we're gonna go into the discussion.